Let's get started, folks. I am Dr. Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project. If you're not familiar, the REP Project was started by Jennifer Siebel Newsom after making her popular documentary Misrepresentation in 2011 that raised awareness about sexism in media. And she's gone on to use impact filmmaking to really shift the culture. And part of that is our End Rape campaign, the goal of which is to shift attitudes, opinions, and ultimately behavior around sexual violence. And this is an interview series on the causes and consequences of sexual violence. And I want to give a trigger warning, an activation warning. Folks, we will be discussing sexual violence directly during this conversation, so please take care of yourself. I am delighted to introduce to you Dr. Bill Flack. Let me go through Bill's bio, and then we will get right into some questions, and you will be blown away by his expertise. Dr. Flack is trained as a clinical psychologist, and he has taught for over 20 years at Bucknell University, focusing currently on critical and community psychologies. Bill's research is aimed at understanding and eliminating sources of psychological trauma, especially campus sexual assault and other forms of gender-based violence. His teaching and research are aimed at helping students to understand the shortcomings of current psychological knowledge in order to improve it toward more socially just ends. He's published a number of publications, some recent, I just want to read some titles of recent publications. 2022 publication called Student Responses to Different Differing Trigger Warnings, Replication and Extension. He also authored a piece, Cultivating Cooperation and Community in the Psychology Classroom. So a lot of focus on campus environments. And I will say that Bill and I were just having a conversation. He is joining us from Ireland, and he just let me know that he authored the first studies of sexual violence on college campuses in Ireland, which has inspired some public policy shifts. So it is fantastic to have you here. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you're very humble. I was like, oh, you shifted national policy in Ireland and talking about getting professionals on college campuses and really raising awareness about the fact that sexual violence is an issue everywhere, and on college campuses everywhere. And something I've often heard in the fight, the campus anti-rape efforts, is that, well, yes, that happens in the US, but it doesn't happen here, fill in the blank country. And of course, you're doing the work globally to make sure that we're addressing it everywhere. But let's start with a really broad question about your work. Dr. Flack, what are the shortcomings of current psychological knowledge that we need to address in order to advance socially just ends?
Right. So that's a pretty big question. And I should start, given my bias or perspective, by acknowledging my positionality. I am a tenured white cis male professor. And so all of the both privileges as well as blind spots that go along with those intersecting identities are part of me and part of the work that I do. I think really what I'm talking about in that sort of description of the work that I do, and especially in my teaching, is captured usually by phrases like critical psychology, or in the case of much of the teaching that I do, critical community psychology. But there are two sort of answers to the question. There's one sort of mainstream answer to the question, which is that psychology as a science progresses in the way that positivist-based science progresses. So we have our internal set of rules for deciding whether or not work is good, and ways of improving it. And there's kind of that internal critical process that is supposed to make the science better over time. So that's one way of being critical and sort of progressing psychology. More recently, in the United States, some of us have started paying attention to another critical tradition, which is based on critical theory, so Frankfurt School thinking. And the notion there is that Western academic psychology, so we're talking about the psychologies that have been produced primarily in the United States, in Western Europe, to some extent in Canada, that kind of psychology is almost exclusively focused on individuals, and only rarely, if ever, takes account of social and political context, and especially the role of power in determining what happens to people. And doing all of that entails a very different, not only methodology, but actually epistemology. So the way that we go about producing knowledge in this second of the critical traditions pays attention to things like power and politics, including how it affects the work that psychologists do. So I think psychology, at least US American psychology, is starting to come around to this, so that if you look, for example, at some of the most recent guidelines from the American Psychological Association about undergraduate curricula, they actually do mention critical psychology perspectives for the first time, which is pretty unusual. Probably a better example, though, of this second kind of critical thinking is something called the power threat meaning framework. So this is something, a set of ideas that were developed by British clinicians as an alternative to the medical model of mental illness. And the PTM framework is summed up by promoting a fundamental change in how clinicians address people. And so the sort of central question here is moving from a perspective where, as a clinician, you might in effect be asking somebody who's come to you for help, what is wrong with you? So shifting from that kind of question to an alternative such as what has happened to you, right? So rather than locating the problem within the individual, the problem is then located within the social nexus that the individual has been trying to function in, and where presumably bad things started to happen. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I mean when I talk about the current shortcomings of psychological knowledge. There's certainly still plenty of people in psychology departments who do their work in the traditional manner. But I think that the critical psychology perspective is starting to make some inroads.
Well, and that's a great way of viewing sexual violence, right? Because then you're talking about rape cultures and systems that are creating these experiences, and of course situating the individual within systems instead, and in some really profound way, right? You are saying, look, the responsibility is actually not yours for what you experience. I mean, it really does signal that these are systemic issues, and to that end, I mean, you have been studying trauma for decades. What have you learned about trauma, and what do you wish everyone knew about trauma?
Sure. So unfortunately, trauma is common. We used to think that it wasn't. We used to think that it was relatively rare. So for example, when PTSD as a kind of diagnostic entity was first constructed back in the 1970s, and then appeared in the diagnostic manual in the US in 1980. It was characterized as something that only happened to some people in relatively unusual circumstances. So certainly the context of military combat, primarily, at least at that time, for men, and then sexual assault, primarily for women. But as the field of trauma has grown, and as we've had now what, better than 50 years of dedicated research on it. What we found is that it's far more common than was initially thought, and in fact, the diagnostic criteria no longer indicates that it's a relatively rare thing. So trauma is common. It's often caused by other people, and therefore it's usually preventable. But preventing it requires that we move outside of the sort of standard mainstream individual focus, the sort of thing where, we're basically talking about individual malfunctioning, and moving again into the social sphere. So preventing trauma means that we essentially have to end up taking a political stand and do something about the inequities of power that produce and promote traumatic circumstances in the first place. So there are some kinds of trauma, or some causes of trauma, that are more difficult to prevent. Natural disasters, for example. Although even those are ultimately probably preventable if we were actually going to do something serious about global warming. But other kinds of trauma that have to do, at least in a more straightforward way, with political decisions, like military combat, but also situations that involve differentials in power relationships, like sexual assault, can be prevented, but it requires that we actually not only pay attention to the context in which people are traumatized, but that we also do something about the power relationships within those contexts that allow for those kinds of traumas to occur.
Well, great segue to an obvious follow-up question, which is, talk to us about sexual violence. What do you know about the root causes, and how can we prevent it?
Yeah. So research on campus sexual assault. So my research on sexual violence is focused on sexual assault in colleges and universities, primarily among students. And we've certainly learned a lot since the early work of sociologists like Kirkpatrick and Kanan. So this goes back to the 1950s. And then, of course, the foundational work of people like Mary Koss in the 1970s and 80s, Walter de Kesseretti in Canada in the 1980s and 1990s. So we know quite a bit, actually, about the major risk factors for sexual assault in that context, gender and alcohol being the primary two. We also know that victimization prevalence, depending upon how broadly or narrowly you define sexual assault, is probably somewhere between 20 and 30% among college women. And we've been learning in the last 5-6 years or so that prevalence rates are actually substantially higher among LGBTQIA folks. We need more research on folks in those communities. Most of the research that we have is still focused on so-called weird people, Western educated, folks in industrialized nations, all that sort of thing. But like many other causes of trauma, sexual assault is ultimately going to be prevented by equalizing power relationships. And in the case of campus sexual assault, it's pretty easy to see how this works, right? So if you're on a campus like mine, Bucknell is largely undergraduate institution, so about 4,000 undergraduate students, with a social intimacy culture that is essentially run by the Greek system and run by the fraternities in the Greek system. So the men in the social intimacy culture essentially have all the power. They're the ones who are allowed to host parties. They're the ones who are mixing the drinks. They're the ones who are deciding who gets allowed into parties and who doesn't. And so it's really not a surprise that given that kind of context, which is of course not, peculiar to Bucknell, it's a very common context in many US colleges and universities. It's not terribly surprising that we would find, the same kinds of prevalence rates of victimization that are commonly found in the literature. Ours are usually somewhere around 25 to 30%, again, depending upon sort of how broadly or narrowly you define the problem. But essentially, the problem boils down to one of power. And until we go about making the decisions and doing the sorts of things that we need to do in order to equalize power, in order to actually achieve equity among the genders, I don't think we're going to see a significant shift in this problem.
It reminds me of Peggy Sanday's article that finds precisely that, right? That rape cultures are defined by their gender inequality and imbalance. And I think your research on college campuses is really important because it's basically a microcosm, right? And so if you can identify the mechanisms that are producing sexual violence in a microcosm, then you can take that knowledge and apply it to the broader culture. And of course, the system that you're talking about is patriarchy, right, in the broader culture and on college campuses, but a system where we value men and what they do more than women and what they do, and we assume that men are natural leaders and heads of households, and they are the norm, right? They are the norm of leadership. They are the norm of power. And so a follow-up question on this idea of what we can do to prevent sexual violence. Are there specific things that you can identify in the broader culture that we could fix or do that would ameliorate or at least reduce sexual violence more broadly?
Yeah, I think that we have to start earlier than we typically do. So trying to teach young people about the problems that result from these power inequities by the time they're 18 or 19 is far too late. And for that matter, high school and junior high school are really far too late. We need to be teaching, young boys and girls that gender is not, or at least should not be, a matter of power inequities. But they get so many messages. Even if they don't get the messages at home, they get the messages, from mass media. And I think it's a huge and very difficult job, but I think it's one that that really has to happen in schools and has to happen, from grade school age. So as soon as young kids begin to develop an understanding of how power is related to gender, I think we need to be teaching them about that and what's problematic about it.
Okay, so start early, address the broader issues of patriarchy, and that will lead. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. By the time, as college professors, by the time they reach us, they already have a very calcified set of core values, if it were as it were. So getting a little personal before we kind of zoom back out and talk about trauma again. Tell us about your path to researching this topic. How did you decide to become an expert in this topic? And I bring this up because I know that there are high risks, right, associated with researching various topics, whether it's critical race theory or sexual violence, or whether you're at a high school level or a college level. Tell us about your path and maybe some of the challenges that you've had to navigate as a researcher focused on sexual violence.
Sure. So one of the things that I learned when I got involved in this field and started talking with colleagues who do similar kinds of work is that to a person, I've never met anybody in this field who hasn't had some sort of difficulty following this career path. Right, whether it's a difficult tenure review or just sort of difficulties being supported by department colleagues or having difficulties with campus administrators or whatever it might be, that there's always something like that in the stories about people's career paths. How I got involved in this was actually because of my students. So I showed up at Bucknell in the fall of 2000. I had done a 2-year postdoc at the National Center for PTSD at the Boston VA. And I thought that I was going to have a career in doing research on military trauma, combat-related trauma. So I was teaching a seminar, an upper-level seminar, and the students in that seminar got interested in a discrepancy that they noticed between the numbers of cases of sexual assault that were being reported by our public safety department because of requirements of the Clery Act that all colleges have to report anything essentially that comes to their attention that could constitute a crime. So of course that includes various forms of sexual assault. So we looked at that report and then we looked at the research literature, which was far smaller, back in the fall of 2000 than it is now. I mean, I get updates every day with, at least a dozen or so brand new articles in this area. The field has just been exploding. But in any case, so the students noticed this discrepancy, very low numbers in single digits being reported by the university on the one hand, and yet, looking, for example, at Mary Koss's groundbreaking research and seeing that the numbers, probably were much higher, and then also comparing both of those numbers with their own experiences of participating in the social intimacy culture at college. And so they thought, well, that doesn't seem quite right, that this is the only information that's coming out about this locally, because you might think if it's only half a dozen cases, maybe it's not as big a problem here as it is other places. And so that's how we ended up doing an initial survey. This was back in the days when we were still using paper and pencil and still having people, show up in a classroom to fill out the surveys. So we kind of lived through the shift in methodology from doing that, in person on paper to now, having people fill out the surveys on their phones. And that first survey was really eye-opening for a number of different reasons. It was eye-opening for me because I was sitting around a table with students and not having been an undergraduate in the fall of 2000 for the better part of 40 years at that point, I had no idea. I kind of thought that things were the same as they were back when I was a college student. But the students, we were talking about risk factors, and alcohol was the obvious one. But students were talking about hooking up. And I sort of knew what hooking up was because I'd watched Sex and the City, so I knew what Friends with Benefits was about. But I didn't understand how ubiquitous hookup culture was. And I also didn't understand how complicated it was. But in any case, we asked about hooking up as well as asking about alcohol use. And we found out that hooking up and alcohol were both significantly related to sexual assault. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that was the first paper came out in Journal of Interpersonal Violence back in 2007. The first paper to demonstrate that hooking up was a risk factor for sexual assault. So not too many years down the road from there, we started doing these surveys pretty much on an annual basis. And I have a research team every year, mostly juniors and seniors. Sometimes the seniors are doing honors theses. We do either 1 or 2 surveys a year, depending upon what the students are interested in pursuing. In any event, going backwards just a little bit for a moment. So that work then led to an invitation to be part of a group that came to be known as the ARC3, which stands for Administrator Researcher Campus Climate Consortium, or collaborative or collective or whatever it is. In any event, the ARC3 came out of a couple of meetings that were held in 2014 and 2015. The meeting in 2015 was at the University of Wisconsin, and it consisted of campus sexual assault researchers, Title IX coordinators, and deans of students. And we came together essentially because the Obama administration had released a White House task force report, which some of the folks in the ARC3 group had actually been part of. And central to that report was a call for the development of campus climate surveys focused on gender-based violence. So that group of us at Wisconsin spent a weekend sequestered in a hotel room. 48 hours later, we came out of it with a survey that met the needs of all three groups, and that was also research-based. So it's a modular survey. When we made it available for free. It still is available at no cost. But each of the constituent measures in the ARC3 survey are scales that had previously been tested and validated and published in the research literature. What we did in testing the survey was then to look at the associations among those scales. And so that's what we did with the pilot test on 3 different campuses. And then we published the results of the pilot in the APA journal Psychological Trauma back in 2019. So the ARC3 survey has kind of exploded. As soon as people started finding out about it, schools were contacting the group to get a hold of it. I think it's been used in literally hundreds of schools across the United States at this point, and has been adapted in other contexts. So that was kind of the next phase of my work. I was really fortunate to get 2 Fulbright scholarships. The first one in the fall of 2015 to do this kind of work at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, working with Cherie R. Moore and Susan Lagden, and then in the fall of 2019 at the University of Galway in the Republic of Ireland, working with Padraig McNeela, who's probably best known for having developed what he calls an active consent program, which is an amazing thing. So it was kind of a combination of things. Some of those I more or less lucked into. But I think what's really been central about doing this work, and that I always try to emphasize, is the role of students. So students are obviously the respondents to the surveys, and that's of course crucial. But doing this work with students as research collaborators is utterly vital. Whether it goes back to that sort of example of my not knowing about hooking up back in the fall of 2000, or whatever it is, they are, of course, the experts on their own social intimacy culture. Those of us who teach and do research at universities, we leave at 5 or 6 o'clock at the end of the day, and we really don't have a very good idea of what's going on after hours. And the students obviously do. So I think this research is not only usefully informed by the involvement of people who are participating in that culture, but they're really vital, I think, to the success of doing this research in terms of developing, hopefully an increasingly better understanding of what's going on, so that we know what it is we need to deal with in terms of putting prevention programs together. Sorry, that was
Absolutely.
a bit of a long-winded.
No, so I have so many follow-up questions, but one that immediately springs to mind is um, the risk factors, right? So hookup culture and alcohol use. And don't worry, folks, a few more questions and then we'll get to your Q&A. So start thinking up your questions, pop them in the Q&A now if you would like. So in talking about that, you're obviously not telling young women not to have sex and not to drink, right? It's not an individual level critique. Could you speak more about those as risk factors and how we might use that information to prevent sexual violence?
Sure. So I think that alcohol consumption is at least in part problematic because of the degree to which students are drinking these days. And it's not, of course, that we didn't drink when we were undergraduates, but I don't remember an awful lot of pre-gaming before going to the party. I don't remember, at least as a widespread phenomenon, people deliberately trying to black out, essentially, or browning out, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but it's essentially drinking enough so that you're on the verge of blacking out, but you retain consciousness, essentially, which is an interesting phenomenon and one that's actually not well studied in this part of the literature yet. We've done some preliminary studies on blacking out and browning out and found some interesting stuff. I think with respect to hooking up, it turns out that hooking up is actually a pretty complex phenomena. So we did some research back in 14, that was published in 2016, looking at different types of hookups as they vary by the degree of relationship between the two people who are hooking up prior to their hookup. So that ranged from hooking up with a complete and utter stranger to friends with benefits and hooking up with a former romantic partner. And we thought that hooking up with a stranger was going to be the riskiest kind of hookup. It turned out actually that it was one of the least risky types of hookups. The two types that were highest risk, that is, that were most strongly associated with sexual assault victimization, were hookups with people who would be considered an acquaintance, but not a friend. So there's somebody that you know a little bit, maybe you sit next to them in class, maybe you've met them at a party or something like that, but you don't know them well enough that you'd consider them a friend. And then with former romantic partners. Those were the two kinds of hookups that were associated with the highest degree of risk. And we replicated those findings a couple of times. But I think, like with alcohol, we certainly need to know more about hookup culture and the ways in which hookups can vary. And of course, in general, I mean, one of the things that is true of social intimacy culture is that it's not a static sort of thing, right? It's not sort of staying still so that social scientists can study it for a couple of years and be relatively confident that what they're studying 2 or 3 years down the road is the same as what was happening, say at time one. So it's always something of a kind of moving target, which again, I think underscores the importance of having students involved in the research.
Absolutely.
Did
Yes.
that
No,
answer your
yeah,
question?
very.
No.
I'm just assuming there will be, I'm trying to read the minds of folks who might be watching this to say, hey, what would you like to know more about? So Bill, let's shift gears to talk just a few questions, but hopefully a deep dive into sexual violence and trauma. Can you talk to us about some common experiences of trauma from sexual violence and also talk to us about pathways to healing from sexual violence?
Sure. So both involve relationships with other people. On the front end of the problem, um, one of the common things that happens when somebody experiences sexual assault and they tell other people about it, at least in the campus context, is that they will often be surprised that by the response that they get, excuse me, which is often really negative. Um, so Sarah Ullman, for example, and other colleagues have done work on the social reactions to sexual assault survivors. So one of the things that will often happen, say in the context of a Greek system, is that if a member of a sorority has been sexually assaulted by a member of a fraternity, and if the sorority wants to keep a good relationship going with that fraternity, what will unfortunately sometimes happen is that the very people that survivor would naturally enough assume would form, her, in the modal case, support system, may actually turn on her and respond in a way that's essentially victim blaming. So things like, he's a nice guy, he'd never do anything like that. Or how much did you have to drink? All the sort of standard stuff. But you're getting it from people that you would anticipate, if you didn't know the research literature anyway, would be your primary sources of social support, which we know, to get to the sort of positive end of this, is really the most important factor with respect to people's ability to recover, really from any kind of trauma, but especially trauma that's caused within interpersonal contexts. Furthermore, it's not just the people around the survivor who will often, in effect, end up attacking the person for having the temerity to come out and reveal what had happened to them. But often the institution itself will do a very similar thing. So Jennifer Fried, my colleague, who you're going to have in this interview series, has done amazing work on institutional betrayal and institutional courage. And institutional betrayal is also, unfortunately, utterly common. I mean, it's sufficiently common that those of us in the ARC3 group decided, and Jennifer was part of that group, to include her measure of institutional betrayal in the ARC3 survey. So whether you're getting this kind of negative attacking response from people who you thought were your friends, or whether you're getting various forms of essentially betrayal response from your institution, whether it's a Title IX coordinator who's relatively non-responsive, or whatever it might be. That's kind of the negative side. The positive side is that what we know across the broad range of traumatic experience is that the primary source of healing for the vast majority of people is social support. And this, goes to the work of Judith Herman and others, but in Trauma and Recovery, and then in her most recent book, Dr. Herman has always been the one among the sort of leading lights of trauma psychology to really focus on the interpersonal context and how trauma is both experienced typically within the interpersonal context, but where healing also if it's going to take place, is going to happen within the interpersonal context.
Okay,
So,
you're just music to my ears in the sense, Bill, that I've watched this happen so many times, right? The survivor siblinghood, as we call it. That's when people really start their healing journey, oftentimes, when they find out I'm not alone. All these people believe me, all these people support me. And oftentimes they're getting that support from strangers because so many people in their inner circle are not supporting them. And, watching, I was recently in the Danny Masterson trial, the second trial and the first trial, where he was convicted of multiple counts of sexual violence. And this, of course, involved the Church of Scientology, and every Jane Doe who took the stand said the church, I was going to lose my standing. Everybody turned on me. I didn't feel like I could come forward. If I wanted to maintain my social group, the reason that, I shape my life the way that I do, if I want to keep that, I have to stay quiet. And so institutional betrayal, friend betrayal. I hope survivors who are watching this are really listening to the importance of that network and support group. Did you want to say something more on that?
No, it's okay. I just don't think that we can emphasize strongly enough, finding those folks, and they may not be, the people that you think they ought to be. It's really unfortunate. But it also speaks to the pressures, I think, at least within the college context, toward conformity, and toward a kind of attraction to power, right? If you're willing to essentially, respond that way to somebody who you would consider a friend because you think that the relationship of your organization to some other organization, which has something that you want, and it boils down to power, that the latter is more important than the former. I mean, I've just seen that happen so many times. And I suspect, by the way, that one of the reasons that women are far more likely to transfer from one college to another is that many of those folks have experienced assault. I don't actually know of any research on that, and I've had difficulty figuring out how to get that done. But I think that's one of the things that we need to be looking into.
Yeah, that's my gut too, Bill, having watched so many students transfer and knowing what they had experienced and then watching their response. And of course, sexual violence is a Title IX issue. It's a gender equity issue in education. And people will say, well, how does Title IX apply here? Well, it's because experiencing sexual violence oftentimes shifts your entire educational trajectory. Your whole life trajectory gets essentially thrown off course. And just to follow up on, your survivor siblings or people, your support system may not be people that you kind of commonly think of. I'm just thinking of all of the male survivors from, that I've met at protests who are now, good friends, who are survivors of Catholic priests, and Michael Jackson survivors, and Bryan Singer survivors. And so we used to say in the network, survivor sisterhood, and now it's very clearly survivor siblinghood. And I think it's just important to note, oftentimes you have this deep bond with male survivors. You never thought, that would be possible, but it's the love and support that's so necessary. I have, let's jump into questions here. I actually had a parent of a survivor of sexual violence right when they saw the topic of this, and they ask, if I can ask you, what contributions to healing can a parent make for the future? And is there any guidance for what you might be able to say to the children of the victim?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I'm trying to think of the cases that I've known about individually. Really being supportive, being willing to listen. I think that students often fear that they're going to get the same kind of betrayal response, or be attacked, by their parents as they are all too often by by their peers. And that does happen sometimes. We don't actually have an awful lot of research on parents' responses to their adult children, revealing to them that that they've been victimized. But I think certainly being supportive and support, especially in this context, means focusing on what the survivor wants. Right. So we've got some problematic policies, things like mandated reporting that are just, anathema when it comes to trauma-informed work in this area. I think that if people, whether parents or otherwise, understood that it's really important in the context where somebody has been traumatized by essentially having their their sense of self-efficacy violated, that we don't go and do that again by essentially telling them what to do, right, or insisting that they do something, because there's no kind of one size fits all here. Depending upon how long it's been since the target trauma, people will want very different things, and we really have to start essentially by both believing the person, but also by listening and asking them what it is they want, and often what they want is simply someone who will listen. Right? It doesn't take a PhD in clinical psychology to do this. A lot of people think, that you have to be a trained therapist, and that's just not right. What you need to do is you need to think about this as sort of similar to, how you would deal, say, with a next door neighbor or a friend who came to you with some kind of significant problem. Hopefully at least part of that interaction would be listening. Saying things like, so, what do you want to do? How can I help? And again, often, at least in the case of campus sexual assault, and we do have good research on this, often what people want is simply a sympathetic ear. Right? I mean, most people do not want to go through Title IX. Most do not want to go to the local prosecutor. Most people just want somebody who's going to listen. And that's then closely followed by wanting some sort of response eventually from the perpetrator that indicates that, they're going to apologize. I really think, hopefully this isn't getting too far afield with the answer to your question, but I think we make a mistake in college campuses by trying to replicate the legal system in our misconduct system on campus, in part because the legal system, as you well know, almost always fails sexual assault survivors, right? I mean, prosecutors very rarely take these cases. The cases that they take rarely result in convictions. The convictions rarely result in any kind of, significant action. And a carceral approach to this problem is just not going to work anyway, but the data are clear that the legal system fails. So we shouldn't be doing this again on college campuses. What we really should be doing, and Mary Koss has been one of the people who've really been pushing this approach, is looking at a range of alternatives that include restorative justice approaches. I really think that given what most survivors tell us that they want, that restorative justice approaches and ones like that, where people are given the opportunity, if they decide to take it, in terms of dealing with perpetrators, to try to somehow make amends. I mean, you can never obviously do that in a complete or comprehensive way. Um, but that's, that's what most survivors are telling us that they want, and we should be listening, right? We
Indeed.
shouldn't be assuming that we know, oh, it's a crime, so we should deal with it, as a legal matter. There's certainly a place for that. But for the vast majority of cases, and certainly in the college context, I think that we need to be using alternative models.
And Dr. Alyssa Ackerman is going to be speaking about that later in this series. I couldn't agree with you more, Bill, because I hear so many of my students saying that, right? And of course, part of the reason they don't want to go through the process is the process doesn't work. And also they know they're going to face the stigma and the social isolation. And so we need to deal with, maybe more of them would want more punitive measures if those measures were available. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Restorative justice is certainly something we hear so much from survivors in terms of what they want. And we have a great question here. Eve would like to know more about the active consent model. Can you talk more about that, Bill?
Right. So this is a program that was developed by a fellow psychologist at the University of Galway. And his name is Padraig MacNeila, Macneela. So you can Google him and find out all kinds of information about the program. It's it's an interesting, creative, novel approach to doing prevention education in universities. And the approach, while being developed by Padraig's group at Galway, has actually, I think he's been around certainly most of the universities in Ireland, but also many of the universities throughout the UK now. But one of the things that's that's really novel about this is that Padraig partnered with a colleague in the theater department at Galway. And what they did was this colleague actually developed a play called, I'm not going to get the title exactly right, but it's something like The Kinds of Sex You Might Have at College, that sort of thing. And I remember when I was there in the fall of 2019 going to see this play, and it was wonderful. The student actors were wonderful. I got to meet the director from the theater department. But a really kind of creative approach. Most of the prevention education that you see, certainly in US college campuses, is either, some 10-minute online thing that your university makes you do, before you start classes in your first year, or maybe some prevention education, that you're required to show up to if you're on an athletic team or if you're in a Greek organization, that sort of thing. Which, students, it's just sort of an eye-rolling kind of experience, right? Especially during first year orientation, when people are getting bombarded with all kinds of other information, and the only thing they're really thinking about is where the party is going to be that night.
Yes.
Oh,
And sorry to interrupt your thought. Heavy subject, so we often have our kitten for some therapy relief. So sorry, please continue. Combining, like actually
that's
meeting
okay.
students where they are
Yeah,
and doing it
exactly.
in a way that's entertaining and breaks through rather than some standard trainings.
Exactly. Um, and I'm actually not sure whether I know that Padraig's got some outcome measures. I don't think that he's actually looked at changes in prevalence rates. And that's actually one other, I think, really important issue when we're talking about prevention education. As far as I know, and this isn't really my specific area of expertise in this area, but as far as I know, I think the only prevention education effort that has shown a significant decrease in the prevalence rates at which women report being assaulted is a program that Charlene Sen developed in Canada, which was a combination of self-efficacy training and self-defense training. And what she showed in at least one study was I think it was somewhere around a 50% reduction in prevalence rates of women reporting sexual assault. Now that's a single study, single university, one
But
country.
impressive,
But
outcome.
yes, nonetheless, absolutely impressive. And I believe I've heard through the sort of grapevine that there is an attempt to replicate that study with a new multi-site study. I haven't seen the results or heard anything about the results of that yet. Of course, the problem with that is that we are, by taking that kind of approach, putting the onus of responsibility on,
Potential victims. Yep.
exactly.
I view it as twofold. I mean, definitely we need the institution to act, and we need institutional betrayal to stop. And there are many things institutions can do, which you and I, you've been sharing. You and I are aware of being at these institutions, and of course you make that same argument for reducing sexual violence in prisons, reducing sexual violence in the military, any institution that has its own set of rules which amplify rape culture, but also just preparing people who might be potential victims, and empowering, right? Because we do live in a rape culture, and I know oftentimes I'll talk to parents about that, and they'll want these tools. And I know we have time for only one more quick question, but I'm going to combine two because they're very similar, right? So Lynn writes, the problem of sexual assault on campus does not seem to be reducing, even though it has been studied. What work is being done on identifying and implementing solutions? And then an anonymous attendee asks, if funding and other barriers weren't a concern, what research and actions might you want to see to advance the movement to end rape? So you have a magic wand, Dr. Bill Flack. What are we doing?
I think it all comes back to essentially an issue of equity and power. I think that we have to be empowering people who currently don't have it, and I think that that's going to entail de-empowering, unempowering, whatever the opposite of being empowered is, of people who currently have it. Right. So, I mean, in order to achieve that balance, the people who enjoy the privilege of having the power to essentially, if not at least individually, produce this problem in the form of perpetration, to certainly be part of a system that produces and that aids and abets perpetration, that power needs to be taken away. And I think until we're willing to do that, it just seems to me that I can't imagine any kind of intervention that's going to take this problem to zero. So it's, on the one hand, a very tall order. On the other hand, I think we know how to do that. And especially if we take a kind of intersectional and ecological approach where we're essentially doing kind of power mapping and figuring out who has the power, and then going to those people and saying, all right, so this is your problem, right? This is not the problem of the survivors, it's the problem of the people who are producing the problem in the first place. And saying to those people, what are you going to do about this? Because you have to do something about this. We simply cannot tolerate the continued traumatization of a third of people just in the college context, let alone in broader contexts.
Yes, thank you. That is the incredible Dr. Bill Flack. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your guidance and expertise. It's really wonderful to speak with you. Thank you for joining us from Ireland as you're traveling. And folks, please check out Dr. Flack's research. And we'll end with the therapy kitten right here. Have a wonderful day, everyone. And again, thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Bye.